Okay, good afternoon. Can I have everyone take their seats because we're going to get started?
Yes. And then next to me.
Can everyone please take their seats so we can get started? Great. Thank you so much for coming. I know it's been a long 2 days. We're here at the last panel, the last formal panel before closing remarks. You've all been here at this conference, which has talked over 2 days about the many challenges that are facing younger generations. We've talked over the past few days about how demographically new generations are being shaped by urbanization and by the total ubiquity of social media. We've talked economically about how these generations are shaped by increasingly precarious labor markets. And we've talked scientifically about the myriad challenges accompanying a warming planet. But key to understanding what this will all amount to politically is mediated by questions of identity and questions of culture. How will new generations respond to these changes? Will they organize new political movements? And what will those movements look like? Those are the questions that we want to address in this final panel. And luckily, we have 3 fabulous panelists who've thought very hard about these questions already. We're going to ask them to share their wisdom. So I'm going to start with Jiayang Shaw, who is the principal of Harris Manchester College and has traveled from all the way across town. She's a professor of religion and history, and she's one of 4 principal investigators of the iGen project. It's a project that's based here, Lancaster University and Stanford University, that looks at UK and US post-millennials. We also are lucky enough to have 2 of her co-authors in the audience here, so they might jump in. Next to Jane, we have Snigdha Poonam, who is a national affairs writer for the Hindustan Times in Delhi. Her work has been featured everywhere, the New York Times, The Guardian, The Economist, The Financial Times. But importantly for our purposes, she's written a book called Dreamers: How Young Indians Are Changing Their World. And lastly, we have Jiayang, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker, and she's reported extensively on Chinese and U.S. politics, but she's also written several incisive articles about the Hong Kong protests. So I'm going to start in the order that they're sitting next to me, and I'll start with Jane. So Jane, can you start by telling us about the iGen project, which consists of surveys and interviews and more? What can that project tell us about the identities and the values of these younger generations in the US and the UK?
Okay, thank you very much, Maya. So I'll just talk briefly about the scope. It's interdisciplinary. There are 4 of us, a linguist, Sarah Ogilvie, who's here, an anthropologist, Roberta Katz, who's here, Linda Woodhead, who's a sociologist, who's not here, and me, a historian. And we had 4 sources of information, of research. So we conducted a study of 18 to 25-year-olds, first of all, through interviews, and we trained them to interview each other because we figured they'd say much more to each other than to old people like us. And those interviews were of 18 to 25-year-olds at Stanford, Lancaster, and Foothill, which is a community college in California. We created a corpus of 70 million words of their language, scraped from social media. We did YouGov surveys in the USA and UK, and we also commissioned a short series of articles from iGeners themselves, parents, teachers, and others, which we published in Pacific Standard. So let me say that, first of all, absolutely central to the findings is the question of identity. Identity is extremely important to post-millennials, and that's about being real and finding who you are, right? Coupled with a respect for other people doing that. So that's at the core of this generation's value system. This leads to modular belonging. The groups you belong to obviously relate to your identity. Your identity can in some ways be fluid, about some things yes, about some things no, but that also relates to the groups you belong to online and offline. And at the heart of all this is authenticity. You don't claim to be who you aren't, and you don't join a group that you have no right to join. So at first glance, this may look like a narrow set of identity politics, but we quickly realized it wasn't, because when we asked them about the big issues and concerns that they had, that was very much around some of the big global issues we've already talked about in this conference. Number one absolutely was climate change, followed by questions of discrimination and equality around race and ethnicity and sexuality and gender. Other questions of gun control, particularly in the States, and police violence, and otherwise global unrest. And so there was a sense that that these bigger questions were not unrelated to their identities and belongings, right? And in a way, we began to realize that there was a sort of what we've called in the forthcoming book a super ethic, which was about how do we respect others and the planet as well. And on the whole, that was shared by pretty well most of the people we interviewed and surveyed. As one student said, I don't know why we've become a liberal generation, except I feel like over time we've become more progressive. And I should say that the way we've written the book is absolutely through the words of the iGeners. Most of the post-millennials we interviewed feel it's their role, and for some their burden. We've heard the word burden earlier today, to make the world the better place they envision, even if they don't yet know how to do that at scale, right? Most are skeptical, as we've already heard, about institutions that have failed them, which are seen as hypocritical and therefore inauthentic and unequal to the challenge. Many are seeking to engage in politics and activism in a variety of ways. The book started because Roberta and I were administrators at Stanford at the time, and we didn't understand how they were doing activism because it was different than when Roberta was there during the activism against the Vietnam War, and different from when I was a PhD student at Berkeley in the late 80s as a member of ACT UP, worried about AIDS. Okay, so we had belonged to such different types of activist groups, and we wanted, first of all, we don't get them, and then we thought we want to understand it. And we've come out extremely sympathetic when you read the book next year when it comes out to their ways of doing things and being politically active, largely because of the sense of collaboration involved. And we tried to model that in the way we wrote the book, which is entirely collaboratively. It is written as one single voice, although 4 of us wrote it actually together, and we are still friends.
Okay, great. Snigdha, I'm just going to turn to you next. You've written a book on Indian dreamers, right? 1 in 9, I think it's 1 in 9 people in the world is an Indian millennial or post-millennial, right? 1 in 9. So this is a group we care a lot about, if only for their size. Of course, they care about them for other reasons as well. So is there a common set of experiences or identities that unites Indians? And if so, what is it?
Thank you, Maya. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I mean, Indian millennials, I mean, I'm cautious about calling hundreds of millions of people who fall under the age group millennials for so many reasons. And a lot of what I will say will seem like a generalization, but that's just India to you. You know, when we speak about Indian millennials, the common confusion that a lot of people have is to just think of them as generally millennials. And that is in some sense true in that, you know, it's a generation that has grown up shaped by some of the same forces that have shaped people of their age group elsewhere or in many parts of the world, whether you talk about globalization or sweeping urbanization or this like technological explosion. And like elsewhere in the world, millennials in India have been at the forefront of some very positive change, whether it's like fighting for queer rights or against climate change or for gender equality or against caste discrimination. So, you know, all of that is very pertinent. But at the same time, young Indians, which is what I call them rather than millennials, are very different from the idea of Western millennials. I mean, to give you an example, a majority of young Indians want to live with their families. They want to work in the government. They want to marry people chosen by their parents, and they vote right-wing. I think very few of these things will resonate with, say, millennials in the US or the UK. And not all of this is by choice. They want to work for the government because at least the government is offering them some jobs. The job market in India hasn't been this bad in 48 years. 1 million Indians enter the formal workforce every month. I mean, especially at this time when India is going through very challenging, almost precipitous economic downturn. And every day you will see headlines saying 25 million people apply for 2,500 jobs or something like that. So the situation is very, very bad. And so, I mean, it was very common for me to meet young Indians who are, on the one hand, applying for clerical jobs in their local government offices, but at the same time, also dreaming of like launching AI-based, or the world's, actually not even like AI-based, but the world's like next biggest AI-based startups. And there's just like a whole middle spectrum of options that has evaporated, and so they were dealing with that. They want to live with their families, not just because they love their families, because that's very, very true of Indians, but also because even if they have jobs, they can't pay rent. 45% of salaried workers in India earn less than minimum wages set by the government. You know, I mean, similarly, according to surveys, and I speak from 10 years of talking to millennials. I'm one myself, and from many, many people's journalistic works, academic works by NGOs, and you know, election researchers, etc. And what a lot of people have come to conclude is that, like, the majority of young Indians hold quote-unquote traditional values in many things, in, like, say, gender roles, they believe in religious dogmas, they believe in caste hierarchies. So again, it's not your typical idea of a millennial. In fact, I felt like, you know, these 3 decades of globalization that India has seen has changed something. It has changed what young Indians want, but not so much what young Indians believe in. And those are the stories that I explore. And to my mind, it seemed almost like what it had done was caused a pushback, you know, a massive retreat towards what many people call Indian culture, but it's not actually quote-unquote Indian culture, but it's not actually Indian culture, but the cultures of dominant groups in language, in gender, in religion, in caste. And why is that so? And I think it's because our generation in India has had to deal with upheavals like social, economic, political, as I can't think of any other generation that has had to deal with so much in such a little time, or actually on daily basis. And what it has done is it has, you know, it leads people to define themselves more and more against whatever they perceive as threats. So you have caste supremacists and religious supremacists and gender supremacists, and you just name it. And that relates directly to governance in India in the smallest and the biggest way, in every way possible, because you know, because we are so many of us, we also decide who gets to form the government, and we choose the political parties and I think millennials in India choose political parties that represent or fuel that sense of, like, majoritarian victimhood, whether it's in economic opportunities or it is in, you know, in terms of, like, social positions. I mean, suddenly there are young people who are waking up to a world where, let's say, you know, I mean, owning land does not give you as much privilege as knowing English. Across India, there are privileged land-owning communities where the men find it very, very hard to find women who will marry them because the women are more educated suddenly than men. And it is not something that anyone saw coming 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So it's caused complete mayhem. And coming back to governance, so then you choose these political parties that fuel or represent that sense of victimhood. And in everything that that party will do once it is in power will further that. Let's take, this massive project to rewrite history in official textbooks from complete alternative position. You take the rollback of special status in Kashmir. You have a government that will provide job quotas to dominant caste groups that feel victimized or left out of the job market. You will have a government that will let me think of more things.
So let me just jump in for a moment and actually try to draw out a point of contrast and comparison between something that Jane said and something that you said before I turned to Jiayang. And that is that, Jane, I heard you say that US and UK Gen Z, that this group is turning to kind of more micro identities, right?
Absolutely.
And Snigdha, I hear you saying that Indian younger generations are actually in some ways embracing these traditional and these larger scale identities. And politically, I think that I want to ask you both. I mean, Jane, I'll just ask Snigdha for the moment, but that this is it has led to, I think, in part from what I've read of this fabulous new book, Zoomers, a disengagement from formal political institutions. Yep. And in Snigdha, in the case of India, it's actually led to the opposite, right? So the kind of millennials vote for, as you said, Modi and to the right in larger numbers than in almost any other demographic group. So I'd love you to just think about what is causing these divergent kind of political trends and what the dynamics of that are. But let me just turn to Jiayang and I'll actually ask her to talk about some of those similar questions in the context of the Hong Kong protests. So, right, these protests have captured the world's attention. What do you think these protests are really about?
Right. First of all, it's an honor to be here. I was a student here 15 years ago at Exeter College, Oxford, and it's just been a real privilege to be able to walk around and think about my youth, which seems very, very long ago at this point. So turning to the Hong Kong protests. So really, the Hong Kong protests began this summer with a single bill that was very political in its nature. It was it's an extradition bill that would allow criminal suspects to be tried in the infamously opaque courts of mainland China. I visited Hong Kong in September on a reporting trip, and of particular interest to me was how a purely political issue, such as the extradition bill, took on such potent personal significance in a place long suspected of valuing economics over politics among a segment of the population that has been commonly presumed to be the most politically apathetic of all, the millennials. When and how did such heavy and abstract concepts like democracy and freedom and justice take on this visceral importance for this new generation? Are they really at the root of a revolution that would have been inconceivable to their parents just a generation back? And most importantly, how did the political become in such a short period of time so personal? I think to truly understand Hong Kong millennials who are at the heart of this summer's protest, we have to understand the environment in which they grew up, the society that formed them, and both the economic and political forces that informed their social consciousness. Hong Kong, for a long time now, has been at the epicenter of capitalism, globalization, and migration. It's one of the world's most peculiar city-states because while in the last 100 years, it's been reared in liberal democratic values, though most importantly, it was never permitted to be a full democracy, it has found itself in the last 2 decades tethered to this economic juggernaut and increasingly authoritarian regime, China. So like a foster child, it has never had a say in who could be its guardian and how its interest, the interests of Hong Kong, should be served. It's never been allowed, I think, to explore the authenticity of its own identity as it pertains just to Hong Kong, not to Britain, not to China. So taking a step back, I think so much of the Hong Kong protests can be explained in the difference, both in outlook and ideology, that separates Hong Kong millennials and the mainland, Chinese mainland millennials that live not very far away. I think for both these groups, there has been vast social inequalities and fierce competition for resources and opportunities. But I would argue that in the period of their adolescence and young adulthood, they've been pushed to respond to those forces in very different ways. Although China is nominally a socialist state, ruthless hyper-capitalism is its true creed. Economic striving and personal success animates young Chinese millennials because it is by and large the only realm in which these young people have been allowed to operate. It's the only realm in which they feel like they have any room to maneuver. Many are politically apathetic, mostly because I think the legacy of the Tiananmen massacre, in which students rose up against the government, have convinced many that activism only invites trouble. I think that has remained, for the 80s, for the 90s, and generation and the ones in the early aughts. And speaking to mainland millennials who do take an interest in politics, they believe that change, for the most part, can only be promoted from within the existing system. They are exceedingly pragmatic, and they see no point in agitating to topple the current regime, which they find to be patently impossible. Hong Kong millennials, by contrast, see the protest as a moment of awakening, and crucially, as an awakening of their Hong Kong identity. In taking to the streets, they are actively rejecting the apathy of their parents' generation, many of whom still identify as mainland Chinese, and also I think the pragmatism of the mainlander millennials, this kind of sense that if I can get ahead, that's what I should focus on. Many of the young Hong Kong protesters were born around the time of Hong Kong's handover from Britain back to China in 1997, and they have grown up with the pillars of a Western liberal democracy, taking for granted things like a free press, freedom of the speech, an independent judiciary, and they can't imagine living in a society in which those are not present. It's the mainland, rather than the West, that right now feels like a foreign country, and that feels to them to be truly alienating. Many of the parents of today's millennials in Hong Kong were economic refugees who are then fleeing what was very much a backward country. For them, survival and economic stability has always been paramount. And political representation, I think, around the time when they were millennials, was largely irrelevant. Their children are very different. They're raised in one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities. They inhabit, most importantly, this middle-class mentality that, to their immense frustration, they can't realize given Hong Kong's current relationship to the mainland. For this generation of young Hong Kongers, political complacency and social indifference is death. And working within the system, being an insider is no longer tenable when the government, in their view, has unconscionably betrayed their trust. Their well-known rally motto, "Be like water," manifests their vision of a leaderless movement facilitated by technology and social media that is also an active rejection of that fastidiously top-down hierarchy in Beijing. That's been the reigning political model in for the Communist Party for the last 80 years. So how long can the protest last, and will it succeed, are questions that these millennials are being asked, I think, on a daily basis. But for them, pragmatism takes a back seat to a sense of hope and this ambition to take full control of their future. Many of them told me in Hong Kong that against overwhelmingly unfavorable odds in their face-off against Beijing, to do anything less than resist, no matter the consequence, amounts to a moral failure. So lastly, for this generation, political change means interrogating the incompetence and inadequacy of the current system, and if need be, erecting a new one. It means disavowing a political order which has alienated them as outsiders and building a new one which aligns with their values and middle-class mentality. It also, I think, means, most importantly, taking ownership of their identity and of a future that seems increasingly uncertain.
Great, fantastic. Let's turn to gather questions from you. This is, after all, meant to be interactive. So what I'll do is I'll gather 3 or 4 questions and then turn to the panel and I will keep track of them. So who has a question? Yeah, let's start at the back there. Wait for the mic.
So my question is from South Asia. So recently Pakistan blocked a law where if you are non-Muslim, you can never be a prime minister or president. But then you have Pakistanis in UK celebrating Sadiq Khan, the Pakistani origin mayor of London. We have cows in India better protected than Muslims. We have, like, in Bangladeshi, people talking about, are you Bengali first or Muslim first? My problem is people I talk here in Oxford and Cambridge, postdocs and PhD students from South Asia, they also feed in these right-wing narratives and vote right-wings. Why is that? And like, how to fight that hypocrisy?
Wait, I didn't understand the question.
Sorry, it was a loaded question. I'm saying that educated people from South Asia living in the UK, they also cherish and foster this hypocrisy. And how to fight that?
So right, thinking particularly in the context of Asia, how to fight right-wing kind of narratives. Okay, who is another question? Yeah, let's go there, and then we'll go there next. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It is fantastic. And Anna, when you're talking about both of you, particularly India and China, Hong Kong context, I'm really interested in, the rise of nationalism, the rise of agency, right? How much these are influenced by globalization, which we can call second wave of colonialism. Thank you.
Great. So how much is nationalism fed by globalization? Please introduce yourselves when you speak. I think we have a gentleman here who had a question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mark. I teach at SOAS in London. Fascinating panel. I was incredibly taken away by the stats of how many Indian millennials are entering the workforce every month. What was it again that you said?
1 million.
1 million people entering the workforce every month is quite a statistic. My question is about voting of millennials in Indian elections. Because of the way the family unit is still so strong there, I just wondered if you believe that people still voted how their families vote. And I'm thinking particularly of spending in India on things like the nuclear weapon program, which has traditionally been always just accepted that that's a reasonable thing to spend money on. I happen to be a campaigner for nuclear disarmament, so it's a loaded question. I just wonder if there's any thought that millennials might have a different view on what Indian money should be spent on, rather than what their parents spent it on.
Okay, so political attitudes, and one more right over here.
Snigdha, this
Can you just introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Shrenik. I'm the editor of Madras Courier. This question is particularly to you. I'm interested in trying to understand to what extent is fake news influencing the attitudes of young people who are not very well educated and media literate.
Okay. Okay, so we have a small range of topics here about right-wing, the rise of right-wing activism, the relationship between nationalism and globalization, what explains the voting patterns of millennials, and particularly in India, and what is the role of fake news in forming some of these political attitudes. So why don't we go in reverse order? Do you want to take a stab at any of these questions?
Sure. The relationship between globalization and nationalism, especially in mainland China, is something I have been very interested in and actively investigating. I think it's also a question that is often presented to me as a Chinese American writer. This sense of this sense of how do I live with my dual identity and my allegiance both to my Chinese self and my American one. I think that I think about the George Bernard Shaw quote that patriotism is just, you know, loving the country. I mean, this is a paraphrase, but just loving the country that you happen to be born in. I think that is certainly a lot of it. I also think that in China, you have there are two things going on. One, much of Western media focuses on, I think understandably, the patriotic brainwashing that happens in China through textbooks, through the media, which are all controlled by the government. But I can also understand how the term brainwashing can be offensive to an entire country of people who want to feel like they have agency, and many of whom take great pride in the vertiginous rise of China in the past several decades. So the fact that Western media is focusing on the fact that big bad government has taken agency away from good, but mostly naive or brainwashed people, rubs Chinese people the wrong way, and I think quite understandably. So I really think that for us to really understand nationalism, we have to be much more nuanced, and I think take a much more complicated approach to the forces that are kind of animating Chinese, especially young Chinese people's sense of identity. I think that there is, undeniably, very sophisticated propaganda pushing going on, and the Chinese state has become, I think, much wiser in the way that they direct this narrative. But there is also, I think, an organic sense of pride that many Chinese people feel in their country, but also this bleeding of national identity and personal identity. I think that for a Chinese person, when someone else insults China, it doesn't feel like an attack on the Communist Party, which is beyond their reach. It feels like something that's much more emotional and personal. It feels like you're attacking their dignity and their sense of self. And I think that's very, very important for those of us who are studying and writing in the West to realize that it's not purely about the political. It's about in this moment of globalization and social media, this narrative is this collapsing of the social, of the political and the personal.
Snigdha?
Thanks. I think I have 4 questions, and I will answer them in the order in which they were asked. There was a question from, I think, this section about the right-wing rise. And I know what you said about people, meeting Indians or Pakistanis or Bangladeshis in Oxford or in similar spaces, who are educated, who are elite in every other way, and they still believe in the kind of stuff that I was talking about. Yes, absolutely. I don't think that so many people who will think that just because someone is educated, especially in the South Asian context, or because they live in cities or they speak English, that they will somehow be more liberal. And that is not at all true. I really hope that I did not give an impression that, the millennials that I meet in Delhi and Bombay are necessarily more liberal than those that I meet in small towns and villages. No, I think that, the same impulses apply to people in very wide-ranging places. What can be done? I don't know. I mean, one way is for people to do what they do, and I think that, like, at least in India, and I think partly in Bangladesh and Pakistan, you have an active civil society, and it has to do what it does. Journalists have to do their work, and lawyers have to do their work, and activists have to do their work, and I think that's, in my experience, that's like one thing that's really holding things in some kind of sane order, and let's hope for some positivity, if not in the near future, then at some point. About nationalism and globalization, yes, there's a very clear relationship. I spoke about it earlier as well, because I said that it almost seems like these 3 decades of globalization have led to this very narrow idea of nationalism, and nationalism as it's practiced in India today is not so much about loving the nation, but about calling out people who are seen as acting against the interests of the nation. And the interests of the nation is somehow synonymous with interests of the ruling establishment, or the mainstream politicians, or even the ideologies of the ruling establishment. So, feminists are anti-nationals, and people who believe in secularism are anti-national, or people who believe in equality of castes and religions are anti-national. And every other day, you will have lists published and made viral on social media of the anti-nationals of that week. I have featured in one, and I love my country very much. And every night on these TV debates, anchors will ask their viewers to identify anti-nationals amongst them in their communities and to out them and to take action. So, nationalism is, or this idea of nationalism is one of the biggest threats that India faces today. What's the next?
Fake news.
No, I think there was voting.
Yeah.
Voting, yes. Very interesting question again, because before every major Indian election, so much time and space and money is spent trying to understand if young people will vote differently from their families and from their communities and from their traditional networks. And actually that is not true. And I have covered so many major elections as a journalist, and I did not find that to be true in a very large sense. They do vote, continue to vote according to the interests of their caste and community and religious networks. Sometimes, in fact, you will see that because they are driven more and more by what they what they receive, the information that they receive online or through social media, and actually this.
So are you disappointed
Yeah, let's keep the, because we have lots of people who are interested,
Actually, this relates to the question about fake news because, yes, there is fake news. I can't remember who asked that question, but in the last couple of big elections, fake news has influenced the verdict, or forget influencing the verdict, but has played a huge role in how people received information and how narratives about elections were shaped. And I have written a lot about it that you can easily find. And again, it's it's one of the biggest threats for Indian democracy right now.
Jane, what would you...
I'll just say something very briefly about identity and nationalism and nationality, because when we asked the students in the interviews about their identity, very few of them mentioned anything to do with nationality unless it was very directly relevant to them, which was they were an international student studying in either UK or US, they were first or second generation immigrants, or they were undocumented, or members of their families were undocumented. So for the most part, they didn't talk much about nationality. On the other hand, and I want to make it clear now that I'm talking about post-millennials, not millennials. We very deliberately decided to study a group of people who had known the world, had never known the world without the internet. So in terms of their identity formation, the internet is extremely important because you can find someone like you, but they might be halfway across the world. So the global was extremely just taken for granted because they'd never known anything but the internet. Whereas, old people like me knew the world without the internet. And actually millennials did just too.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Over here, can we get... And then at the very back there. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and start?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. My name is Suta, and I'm a student here at the Blavatnik. Sugar Muna was here earlier, and he spoke about how young people are the most politically active and woke. And in thinking about the context of the protest in Hong Kong, how have young people been navigating the intergenerational tension, and what future are young people in Hong Kong in thinking about for themselves in Hong Kong and also for Hong Kong?
Great, thank you. Back there? Oh, just speak up.
Can't hear.
Girls living in huts, but they've studied biotechnology in college. And for example, the person who does the Amazon deliveries earns around £200 a month, but he has an engineering degree. So while there's a lot of aspiration and desire for dignity amongst the youth in countries similar to India as well, I don't see that happening in terms of the kind of pay that they get or the kind of jobs that they get. It does not commensurate with the kind of qualifications that they have. And so I just really want to know what drives the youth. I mean, given that they aren't really being recognized. And this is true for different countries, because if you look at developing countries, for the first time in 70 years, you have youth who are not going to earn as much or attain a living standard like their parents. So that's one. And my second question is...
just one question, because we have lots of people who have questions. Yeah, right behind you is also a question.
Hi, my name is Vinay. I'm a doctor in Northwest London. I'm a British Indian. So you see when Modi goes to, just recently had something called Howdy Modi in Texas. So the Indian diaspora is well across from the UK to the US. And you do find a huge wave of support for Modi's government, including myself. So just put that out there. So I don't think it's fair to just categorize everyone that supports a certain government and right-leaning to just accept that that's a bad thing. So I wanted to know, on your experience on British Indians, American Indians, Canadian Indians, where there's a huge population of Indian-rooted people, on how their culture and identity is changing over time just because of the administration in India. So does that make sense?
No.
No.
No, it
So
doesn't.
I wanted to know, like, from
Yeah,
your
you dismissed it
experience.
yeah, it's just as a question.
So from your experience.
No, I understood your context, but I didn't understand your question.
Yeah, so my question is, from your experience, how are you seeing any changes in the UK and the US of like British Indians in their kind of political outlook because of what's happening in India? Does that make sense?
Okay, so how are outside of the UK young Indians viewing politics back home in India? Okay, do we have another question? Yeah, back also in the back row in the center.
Hi, I'm Ravina. I'm a journalist from India and a student here at the Blavatnik. My question is for Snigdha. So while I do agree with you that there is a lot of, we're voting right-wing, a lot of millennials are voting right-wing and they believe in the caste system, irrespective of whether they're rural or urban, isn't it also true that there are a lot of urban and rural millennials who also, like, they vote right-wing because they believe in, they're voting for economic prosperity or because they're voting against the Congress, but they don't necessarily believe in the caste system? Or, you know, they believe in the caste system, but they're still voting left-wing, etc. Okay. So can you give us some sort of statistics on what is that divide, what is the nuance there, and how that nuance sort of feeds into the larger narrative? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll take one more question from over here. Yeah.
Great. I'm Callum Miller. You've heard too much from me already during the conference. It's a question for Jane, really. I was really interested in what you said, Jane, about the group showing respect for others who are also pursuing the same process of self-identification and exploration. And I just wondered, our experience here in Oxford, and I think in other university campuses, has been that there is quite a heated debate about freedom of speech, protection of certain minority groups, and safe spaces. And I just wondered, you know, some of the people exploring their identity may reach conclusions which are considered offensive to others. So in your research, did it shed any light on that tension?
Okay, Jane, can you just start us off?
Sure. Yes. In short, yes, they did sometimes talk about that, and that, I mean, just in the way that none of us in this room can entirely work that out, right? I wouldn't have expected a group of 18 to 25-year-olds to have been able to work it out either. So it was the moment where their respect for others to develop their identity and so on somewhat broke down. So I think you've articulated the issue, but they were articulate about that breaking down. Actually, that was the area in which they thought, okay. We get that. We get that that's an issue. On the other hand, safe spaces are important for those who haven't had so much voice historically, and more voice is important for those who haven't had so much voice historically. So there was an articulation of that, but there wasn't a solution. But, you know, hey, do you have a solution?
Okay, Snigdha, you have some sort of contentious questions before you.
What drives the youth? Who asked that? No, okay. Yes, they have so little to really wake up to, the young Indians these days, but especially in villages and small towns. There are so few opportunities on the one hand, and I spoke about the job market and the future of opportunities for them. But on the other hand, there are people who suddenly, because everyone has a smartphone, and they're very, very connected to everything that's happening in the world. They are bombarded with information about what's possible in income, in lifestyle, in other choices. For example, I remember once just thinking to myself that 3 people in 3 very different parts of India had told me, when I'd asked them what you want, that they wanted an Audi car. And I was amazed at why that car and why across, they were very different from each other. And yet they were probably reading the same things or seeing the same kind of Facebook posts or whatever, or advertisements. And so that has been the ideas of what they want are as strong as their total loss of faith in the opportunities in front of them. So it's very common for me, at least, to find people who have like who are graduating with absolutely no idea of what they're going to do next, but they want to become the world's next big this or that, or you name it. And so that's what I think that's the gap that I explore in my book, which you will find interesting. NRI. Yes, an interesting question. I think that's, I agree with you. And I think that because you have suddenly, a politician that represents India who kind of constantly talks about bringing India back to whatever glorious place it enjoyed or it occupied in some remote history, or to in a very Trump fashion, kind of like making India great again, and really representing Indian pride and culture in the global order. That obviously that will make NRIs feel pride and give them a sense of agency and power. So I see the appeal. What I don't see or don't understand is why, and it is true, and books have been written about it, NRIs are at the forefront of this movement to reclaim India's some kind of imagined past of like racial purity and all-around glory, and when they have so little investment in India's future. So I actually don't see how their lives are changing because of who is empowered in India, except that, yes, Modi does give them a sense of agency and power. Last question. Ravina. Yes, actually, for many, many years, I think that for at least, this BJP government under Modi, it has been around since 2014, and for a long time, people have asked what the question that you were asking about, and wondered and engaged in finding answers to about. It's totally possible that people vote for the Hindu right-wing party because it's also promising economic prosperity. But except that economic prosperity has not come, and it is the 6th year of the government. And if that's not clear enough, you just have to listen to the speeches, the election speeches, in which the government's representatives should talk about that economic prosperity that came, right, or that should come. Instead, you will see Hindus and Muslims mentioned way more than, agricultural plans or economic growth or any of the other things that they like to be seen as representatives of. And, you can write to me, I can send you more, articles or research that's done about it, but this question, I used to wonder too, but I don't anymore.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think there's an intersectionality of identity and economic precarity that is, in some ways, is a theme that runs through all of your, and although the political repercussions of that are quite different by context. Jiayang, do you want to talk about the question of wokeness in Hong Kong?
Right. I think the crux of the Hong Kong protests is, as you mentioned, this intergenerational tension, which I would like to call, I think, which I call the intra-household battle, which I really haven't seen anywhere else in the world. It really comes from the fact that in one generation, you have this massive growth in wealth within the family, so that the parents grow up under very different economic circumstances than their children. That leads to a completely different set of values. And in a single household, what you see is this clash of values. For the parents' generation, they are these economic refugees who are seeking a better life, which involves having three meals a day, without any problems, and a piece of property to call their home. For their children, millennials and post-millennials, these are no longer in terms of, that basic standard of living is no longer enough. They have higher aspirations for their existence in the world, and that means having political representation. That means having social accountability. And you have the dark comedy of, some of the highest housing costs in the world in Hong Kong. So in these tiny micro apartments, you have parent and child living together, not being able to speak to each other because I think they see the world in fundamentally such different ways. And this clash of values, I think, is at the heart of this protest. And that's why it's become so intractable in so many ways, because the parents are asking, what else do you want? You've gone to university, you can find a job, try to climb the ladder. The corporate ladder. It's not about idealism. Life isn't about idealism. It's about making the best of what you have. And the children saying back to their parents, you were the ones who provided me with a university education. You were the ones who brought me to a better place. How can you then betray all the conditions that you've given me and tell me that I'm asking for something that is fundamentally unattainable? So I think that tension is very much at the heart of the Hong Kong protests. To, I think, your second question of what are these Hong Kong millennials' hope for the future, I think on the other side of their immense idealism is a very dark nihilism, because they're thinking the life that their parents lived of being satisfied purely with economic stability is not a life worth living. So they have told me, and I think told many Western journalists, that they feel like their very existence is contingent upon realizing that middle-class mentality of having political representation and living in a society that is free and that has, basic civil liberties. So when I talk to them about, that untenability, considering Hong Kong's relationship with mainland China, they'll often, wave the American flag, they'll wave the British flag, they'll wave the colonial flag, because in their mind, the only powers that can deal with that can confront China at this point is the West and the U.S., I think, most importantly. And many of them have said, what we want is World War III, which sounds, I think, perhaps a little absurd to us here, but I think to defend the values that they find to be completely inalienable to them, they require a World War III to challenge this unstoppable rise of the party state that is China.
Okay, so we have time for one more round of questions, and we'll start here with Edie, and then back there.
Hi, Annabelle Margrafter from the National Leadership Centre in the Cabinet Office. This question is more to Jane. I'd really like to hear more about the lines and the categories upon which young people define their identity, and whether there's things more beyond sexuality and race and ethnicity, and also how much does their identity inform their politics, and how much of a priority it is compared to kind of economic factors.
Great. And one more. We had one here somewhere. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm Pedro from Colombia, and I just want to ask, when you talk about China and the propaganda that they show in medias there, and some young people don't talk about the politics there because for them it's like a forbidden topic, But when we talk about that with them, they say that maybe there's also propaganda from the West that show that in China there's like no democracy, and they believe that it's not like that. So I just want to ask if maybe there's a sort of propaganda also from the West in that topic.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm Tom Hale. I teach international relations here in the school. My question is actually about that role, because a lot of the students we teach here in the school work for governments, and many of them are young. And so many of them end up quite frustrated because many of the people who make decisions in governments are a lot older than them. And some of them have to navigate how to be young change makers in contexts where age is often seen as a sine qua non for decision making. And that varies around the world. And actually, I think India and China are two places where I hear a lot of students who come here thinking a lot about this question of how we can be frustrated as we get rising political leaders, because we're going to have to rise and rise and rise and rise for a long time before we actually get to be able to make any decisions. So I was curious how you think these protests in Hong Kong or movements in India, how this will translate into politics, into the decision-making process, especially with government officials.
Okay, and we'll just take one more here.
Hello, I'm Chinese, grew up in Britain. I was a former civil servant, worked in Oxford Job Centre for 1 year, helping the local resident to find a job. My name is Ted. Now I just resigned from civil service and helping a Chinese candidate to campaign for a general election that is coming up 6 weeks later. I think that Chinese in America is doing pretty well in terms of representation in politics, making effective decisions at the senior leadership level. However, Chinese in Britain, we are short of representation, even though we achieved the highest ethnic group in terms of academic excellence. But in terms of career-wise, media and political representation at the senior leadership level is not so great. So as a Chinese grew up in America, what lessons would you possibly share with the transatlantic cousins to us? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to have Snigdha start, and we just have less than 10 minutes left, so we'll just give you a few minutes each to.
Okay. Thank you for your question. I totally agree with you. I used to feel so frustrated that everything in India is around, like, every discourse is around young people because there are so many of us. And yet, like, and so they're discussed everywhere. Every manifesto is full of, like, that reference to them. But there's so limited understanding of what these, we're talking about, again, like I said, hundreds of millions of people. What are these people? What do they want? What are they going through? So there's still very, very little knowledge in political parties, and I speak to politicians all the time about that. So one way to change that is for young people to contest, and I think with every new election you will see more and more people. They may not be winning elections at that rate because it takes so much, in India, to really fight an election. You need to be representing a wide community, you need to have a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like not every 25-year-old can summon all that, but they do fight elections a lot. Again, are the interests represented by political parties or governments? Very rarely. Just talk about jobs. I've already been talking about that for an hour. So, like, clearly, for such a massive voting bloc's, most important interest, it's not something that really drives elections or verdicts so far.
Jiayang.
All right, so a few questions, all very good ones. I'm going to start with propaganda in the West. That's, again, something, in talking to many mainland millennials, some of whom are very competent in using VPNs and scaling the digital wall, they often tell me, listen, we know what's wrong with China. We know that Xinhua and People's Daily hold the party line. But you have the New York Times, you have the Wall Street Journal, you have the New Yorker, all of whom, and the New York Times and the New Yorker in particular, have these very evident liberal biases. How dare you point your finger at the party publications when the New York Times and your own magazine are so blatant in expressing their biases? I would say, for myself, my answer is I want to be very upfront about the liberal values that animate a publication like The New Yorker. I share many of them. I don't know if I share every single one, which is to say that when you have a staff writing body of 50 people. I'm not sure I share the same I toe the exact same line as every single one of them. But broadly speaking, I certainly value freedom of speech and democracy, and I think I'm liberal on the political spectrum. I do want to point out very importantly to the false equivalence that sometimes can be erected between Xinhua and People's Daily, which are essentially state-backed and state-sponsored publications, which have to have party approval on many of their articles, and which do a very effective job of muting voices that go against the state with the biases that are apparent in the New York Times or in the New Yorker, which is to say that at the New Yorker, there's no state directive in what we can write and cannot write. I'm sure that Trump is not fond of much of our coverage of the current administration, but the writers, whatever biases they might have, are writing from their personal perspective. I, for myself, am not constrained by what the editor-in-chief dictates. If anything, the reporting comes organically from what I discover and from the people that I talk to. So yes, I think it would be disingenuous for me to say that there are no liberal biases for the New York Times, for the Guardian, for any number of Western publications. But I think to say that they are of the same degree, that Chinese media and Western media operate under the same set of restrictions and to the most crucially to the same degree, I think is disingenuous. So, that word of propaganda, I think we really want to make sure are not being defined the same way in China and the West. The second question about decision making and how this allergy to hierarchy in the current political order translates to the mentality of millennials and those who are younger. I think so much of the Hong Kong protests is a rejection of the sclerotic political order that currently exists in the mainland China and in Hong Kong to a certain extent. I think even the idea of a leaderless movement, which to many of us might sound naive, I mean, how do you negotiate with leaderlessness, is a somewhat maybe perhaps extreme reaction to this very stringent hierarchy that you see in the mainland and that you see across organizations in Hong Kong. It's not just about the political order. It's about, at the most prestigious universities in Hong Kong, you have this very strict order that you can't violate. And the frustration that the young people feel that no matter how creative or energized they are, there is no way to express their ideas. There's no way to convey their vision for the future to the governing bodies that have power. So protests on the street and these these radical ideas like leaderlessness, I think, is a manifestation of that frustration. We can talk about how realistic they are, but in application, but I think the frustration is becoming increasingly manifest. And then lastly, about
I'm just going to ask you to be brief because we have just a few minutes left, and I want to give Jane some time too. So,
right. About diversity in American, media and political body. I mean, I'm very delighted to hear that you think that in the U.S., that it is more diverse, because we talk often about the bamboo ceiling and the lack of representation and diversity in the U.S. I think just very briefly, two things. One, we cannot ignore the need for political change and for systemic changes that can only happen through politics. So there needs to be more representation in the political body, I think, both in the U.S. and perhaps here in Britain. for those changes to occur. Number two, I think valuing your own voices and being able to be proud of the unique vantage point that you speak from as either a Chinese American or an Indian American, and really not necessarily following this trodden path of being this of the stereotypical white mainstream media figure, but actually viewing the world through your unique Chinese or Indian lens and giving voice to that.
Okay, Jane.
Okay, I've got, I think, 1 minute and 20 seconds. So I just want to respond to that. And I say, I think when I hear you speaking about leaderless movements, it feels to me like in Hong Kong, it's a sharp, very sharp version of what we saw amongst post-millennials in the UK and US. So we, as I said, it was one of the reasons Roberta and I got into it, because we were, as administrators at Stanford, working with activists, and we didn't know how to negotiate, and we had to learn how to.
Does it work?
What did you learn about how to negotiate with it? Tell us.
How to negotiate
well,
with water?
What we learned, I think, was that they had a very deep sense, and we grew to appreciate this, that why do you need a leader when everyone has a different set of gifts? Yeah. So how do you work with that? And that's actually how we wrote the book. We realized we had different sets of gifts, right? So we just learned how to try and do that. Sometimes that was harder, and sometimes it was easier, right? I'm happy to talk about that more later. In terms of identity, to your question, the key primary identity markers were, of course, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and race, and intersectionality was very important in all of that. But many other things were mentioned too, sometimes overtly, sometimes not. So people didn't mention their socioeconomic identity unless they had to. So they either mentioned their economic privilege, or they talked, for example, about being first-generation students. So it's a bit like nationality in that sense. They didn't mention it unless they felt they needed to. Those who mentioned religion, for example, many people talk about religion, but for a lot of people it wasn't on their radar screen. For others, it was about making institutional religion fit their values, because they saw institutional religion as hypocritical, but that didn't mean to say they wouldn't sometimes go to the mosque or synagogue if they felt like it, right? For those who did take on their religion, and I have to say it was mostly evangelical Christians in our sample, pretty well wholesale, they knew they were outliers, and they articulated that very, very, very clearly. They knew their values were then outlier values with regard to their peers. Other issues that came up around identity were mental health, disability, as you might imagine. And then, of course, in the sort of sense of the groups you belong to, that's an infinite number of groups, and we talk about some of the outlier and fun groups in the book. In terms of politics, they're pretty disillusioned with party politics, as you realize. So they talked much more about the big issues. Just to be very briefly anecdotal, when the US elections were coming up, at the beginning of that term, I was teaching a big class of first years freshers, and I said at the beginning of the term, I think, I want you all to register to vote, because it's really important. I can't, I'm British. This is when I was teaching at Stanford. And secondly, I want you all to get a bike helmet, right? Little poll at the end of the term, more people had got a bike helmet than registered to vote. All right? Very anecdotal, I know. But one of the things we say at the end of the book is that we need to put together the post-millennials' deep understanding of these big issues and the crisis with our generation's understandings of how you try and do some of that at scale. So that's one of our conclusions. I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
Unless my colleagues want to say anything more. Okay.
So before I ask you to help me thank the panel, I just want to say that when we're done here, this marks the end of the conference, and I'll invite you all to go out to the Inamori Forum, where we'll have some closing remarks and some drinks. But now it falls to me to say thank you to a really thoughtful set of people.